Welcome to House of History. In the previous episodes, we have seen the Great Elector construct the beginnings of both the Prussian state and army. Through a fortunate change of alliances, he was granted sovereignty over Ducal Prussia by the Polish crown. It was his son, Frederick III, that managed to secure the title King in Prussia, after painstaking negotiations between different stakeholders in the European theatre. This week, we'll look at the second king in Prussia, Frederick Wilhelm I. You might know him by his unofficial title though, the Soldier King, and it was his title for good reason. Sobering up Prussian court and life near instantly after his ascension, there couldn't be a larger contrast to his extravagant, ceremonial-loving father. Welcome to the complete history of Prussia. Born in 1688 as the second son to Frederick I, King in Prussia and Sophie Charlotte of Hanover, Frederick Wilhelm was their only child to survive infancy. As a sole heir, it was clear that he was the crown prince and thus designated successor of his father. He was a child that had a natural aptitude for the running of state affairs. By the age of 9, his father gave him his own estate to manage, which, admittedly, he did surprisingly well. By 13, he attended meetings of the Privy Council, only to penetrate the day-to-day affairs of the kingdom a little later in his teenage years. Throughout his childhood, there was a discrepancy between his father and son, although he had always been respectful to his father. Not to the others at court, however. He was noted as an impossible child, and it is said his personal tutor would have been happier as a galley slave. He assailed his tutors with curses and blows, often stating that the devil take me if I don't have all of you hanged or your heads cut off when I grow up. His cultured mother was worried about his behavior, worrying that it will have evil effects when he grows up. Not to mention the overwhelming resentment the little crown prince felt for his parents' lavish lifestyle. In his opinion, God should be placed before everything, with he himself working hard and developing himself as a disciplined first servant of the state. He rapidly developed himself, already reforming and standardizing aspects of the military at the age of 19. 4 years before his father's death, a conflict arose about inefficient and corrupt ministers. They had hidden the seriousness of a famine that wiped out 1/3 of the population of East Prussia from the king. The crown prince now opposed his father and the so-called cabinet of 3 counts in this matter. The crown prince and his supporters revealed embezzlement and misappropriation of funds, which had worsened the famine due to the lack of grain supplies. Von Martenberg, one of the counts, was forced into retirement, and the civil servants supporting him were either banished, imprisoned, or fined. And as far as we can tell, this was the crown prince's first active involvement in politics. It immediately showed him that deep institutional reform was absolutely essential if the Prussian kingdom was to survive. Now, the king, not being as confrontational as the crown prince, prevented a crisis between them. He allowed his son to, in practice, co-reign Prussia during the final years of his life after getting rid of the ministers. The crown prince never took a liking to the lifestyle of the king though, not even after he was co-reigning Prussia. And that became abundantly clear once he ascended to the throne and ensured all the corruption, misuse of funds and spendthrift would be gotten rid of. Frederick I, king in Prussia, passed away in February 1713. Upon his death, Frederick Wilhelm I now ascended to the throne as king in Prussia and Elector of Brandenburg. A stark contrast with his father, because he immediately dispensed with all rituals and ceremonies, not to mention the high culture court his father kept. The first Prussian king spoke multiple languages and was renowned as a patron of the arts. His son now turned Prussian court culture upside down. He was brusque, distrustful, and prone to violent rages. Although he did have a sharp mind, he never truly mastered written German. If ceremonies did not serve a practical purpose, and I mean a military purpose by that, he bore a natural aversion to it. He was the polar opposite of what was before him. His behavior can also be seen from a different perspective. He despised everything his father stood for, among which treating Prussian finances as his personal wallet. Frederick Wilhelm would become known for being a hard-working and diligent servant of the state, regardless of the fact that he was the king. I'll give you some anecdotes to briefly expand upon his personality, his responses to incoming government papers. Once, several officers of the army requested a transfer, only to be met with scorn and to the gallows that can be transferred. Letters from his advisors were met with, "He's an idiot and can kiss my ass." And anyone that made the mistake to interfere in personal matters was told there was a barrow waiting in Spandau Fortress. No, this king was something different. He didn't even have a coronation, and within days of his ascension started cutting costs. Servants were fired, furniture and paintings were sold. For example, he traded a bit over 100 pieces of rare Chinese porcelain with the Polish king for a regiment of soldiers. In response, artists left Berlin. Ceremonial servants that had been working for over half a century were fired without notice. The famed Brandenburger Orchestra was disbanded. In turn, a much more masculine court quickly established itself, sober, lacking any luxury, and a very, I'd say, an aggressive and hostile atmosphere. Central to the soldier king's new court was the Tabakskollegium, a group of military men that smoked together and discussed political matters. In terms of the crude and informal atmosphere, it bore some resemblance to a military-style fraternity. One of its rules was that its members did not rise when the king entered the room, and everyone was expected to speak their mind. Debates between guests often deteriorated in fights, much to the amusement of the high military men and even the king. When a visiting Berlin professor got in an argument with a famous writer where a punny was slapped, he nearly fell onto the king. The professor asked the king if it was not the most punishable thing to behave in such a way and to attack someone in front of him. Whereupon Frederick Wilhelm replied, clearly enjoying the scene, that a scoundrel deserves the blows he receives. There are many more examples of extreme bullying. Actually, to the degree that I felt I should make a separate video on it. If you'd like to know more about the Soldier King's sadistic court life, check out my next video, either in the History of Prussia playlist or in the description. Now, notwithstanding these questionable practices at court, the new king has been called Prussia's greatest inner king. He is considered the father of the Prussian administrative state. It was because of the expansion and his near obsession with the military that Prussia now required a strong and disciplined civil service. As the king himself wrote in a letter to an old friend of his, if one wishes to decide anything in the world, it cannot be done with the pen if it is not supported by the power of the sword. And under his reign, those words became the unofficial motto of House Hohenzollern. Once again, some anecdotes suffice to show how much the king loved his army and yearned for its expansion. Then again, the name Soldier King kind of gives it away anyway. Sources of Prussian resolutions regarding the army at the time have the king's jotted handwritings in the margins. Often they state something along the lines of, "The increase of my forces ought not to alarm any person, since my only pleasure is my army." In 1713, upon ascension to the throne, the Prussian army numbered 40,000 men. 27 years later, on the deathbed of the king, it had doubled to over 80,000. The armed forces were completely out of proportion, both in terms of the population size and the economy. Over 80% of Prussia's annual budget was spent on its army, and while Prussia numbered 13 on the list of most populous European states, it numbered 4 in the list of largest standing armies. Now, even before he became king, Frederick Wilhelm interfered with his military matters. At the age of 19, he ensured the standardization of all infantry guns, identical daggers, and even cartridge pouches. There was no doubt Frederick Wilhelm was a soldier in heart and soul. Yet, paradoxically, during his reign, the king was hesitant to deploy his army in international conflicts. He thought of his army as too valuable to actually use in war. In contrast to any other Prussian ruler, there was only one conflict he deployed his army in, the Great Northern War, against Sweden, in order to secure access to the Baltic Sea. And to be fair, it wasn't even really his choice. The war had started before he even became king. Another such example was during the War of the Spanish Succession. At the Battle of Malplaquet in 1709, 4 years before he became king, the Prussian army distinguished itself for their courage and discipline. And the Crown Prince earned personal praise from Prince Eugene of Savoy, the renowned General Feldmarshal of the Imperial Army. The king quickly realized that he despised his allies for whichever flaws they had, and after the war, he would never deploy his army again, aside from small border disputes during the War of the Polish Succession. It seemed that expanding his army was more of a goal in itself, the parades, the discipline, and the way of life. He himself barely wore anything but military uniforms, and admittedly, in terms of the military, he was an effective ruler, and Prussian grenadiers became a term well known throughout Europe because of their skill and discipline. Eventually, it would be his army that was polished, trained, and battle ready that would be handed down to his son, the future Frederick the Great. There were projects that were questionable. So the king had an obsession with tall soldiers, so-called lange kerels or tall blokes. He spent an incredible amount of money on establishing his personal regiment filled with these tall men. They had to be at least 6 Prussian feet tall, which is around 6'2" or 1 m 88 nowadays. This unit became known as the Potsdam Giants. Ironically, it wasn't uncommon for these men suffering from a disease rendering them unfit for real military service. And how much did it cost? Well, we'll never know. Right before his death, the Soldier King ordered all the books documenting the administration of this regiment to be burned. If he couldn't buy the soldiers, he'd kidnap them, citing a passage from the first book of Samuel as justification. When Saul saw any strong and valiant man, he took him unto him. An army of this size required many, many professional soldiers. Building forth on the establishment of conscription by the Great Elector, his grandfather, the Soldier King now ingrained this even deeper in Prussian life. The forced recruitment he instituted often went hand in hand with violent regimental commanders that literally abducted farmers' boys. After he ascended in 1730, within a month, he had to change his methods. There were too many protests, and the aggressive expansion of his army worried citizens and imminent war was to break out, not to mention the fact that many sons were forcibly conscripted. Eventually, he settled on the so-called canton system, a system where each district was assigned a regiment where all unmarried young men of age were enrolled. After completing basic training, the soldiers were released in their villages and cities working other jobs. For the next couple of decades, they were reservists. Once war broke out, with exceptions for, say, teachers and artisans, the king could call upon the vast majority of his male population to serve in the army, which was completely new at the time. Soldiers, even when off duty, were expected to wear their uniforms during church services. As such, the Prussian military permeated society and became a respected class of its own. Another benefit, you could say, by reforming the military to this degree was the fact that the king was finally able to subjugate the Prussian nobility or Junkers. In short, these nobles used to reign supreme on their estates without any central authority above them. Their power was now curbed by both a land reform, which we will see in the next section, and a military reform. The king made sure that a census was made of all able-bodied males of noble families between the ages of 12 and 18. They were then to be sent to the cadet school in Berlin, where they were trained as officers. As such, by the 1720s, more or less every Junker family had at least one son serving in the Prussian army. For some poor Junker families, it was great, as an officer received a steady salary. For others, it was simply prestigious to serve the king as officers, distinguishing themselves from regular soldiers. Over the past couple of episodes, we have seen Prussian society change quite a bit. Now, with the Soldier King and his successor, Frederick the Great, this change was going to accelerate. Whereas the Soldier King stood in absolute contrast with his father, some historians point out that his reign was rather complementary to that of his grandfather, Frederick William, the Great Elector. Whereas the Great Elector created an army in order to safeguard the sovereignty against foreign powers, the new king made headway in consolidating the internal administration. In combination with the lack of wars during his reign, he could be considered Prussia's greatest inner king. Before he ascended, already in 1689, there was a central Brandenburg-Prussian revenue office that tracked all the income and expenditures by the crown. By 1696, there was a unified central administration for all Hohenzollern domains. When we looked at the reign of the Great Elector, we already touched upon the establishment of the Generalkriegskommissariat, and throughout the decades this war body expanded its influence to the degree that it interfered with other bodies' tax-collecting ability. When this new king ascended to the throne with all his administrative experience, such as running his own estate, developments only accelerated. There was another event that had a profound impact on his vision of governing, namely the plague and famine of 1709, killing more than a third of East Prussia's population. This was the event that led him to oppose his father and co-reign the last 4 years of the king's life. Crown revenues dropped Farms were abandoned, and neither local nor central administration responded adequately to this disaster. As we have seen, the Crown Prince got rid of the cabinet of 3 counts and started working around the clock to reform Prussia's institutions. He was near obsessive when occupying himself with government affairs, working diligently and hard in true Calvinist fashion. Furthermore, he centralized the organization of crown revenues, with the exception of tax. Several old institutions were merged into the General Finance Directory, a central ministry of finance, if you will. 10 years later, this ministry merged with the only other directory that occupied itself with revenues into the General's Chief Directory for Finance, War and Domains, basically merging all government affairs into one ministry and, if done right, creating a hyper-efficient ministry. Its decision-making structure was designed in a way that not one minister could gain too much power within the state, which was so problematic under the former king's reign. In order to ensure efficient communication between civil servants that had previously worked in rivaling ministries, the king made sure they knew they would be punished if the transfer of information was not done in an efficient manner. On the off chance that a case of corruption was uncovered, and there were barely any, the king made sure the culprit was made an example of. In one such case, the East Prussian Councillor for War, von Schluput, was hanged before the main meeting room of his ministry. Ministers would think twice before they decided to enrich themselves under this new regime. Another interesting aspect of the king's reign was the School Edict of 1717, where primary education was made compulsory for the population. When he reflected on its successes 2 decades later, he conceded that the edict wasn't that successful, but still, for that time, it was incredibly progressive. Aside from all these reforms and changes, there were other developments that took place under the ever so watchful eye of the king. We've already touched upon the Junkers' able-bodied sons being conscripted in the army as a way of getting them in line with the king's objective. As for power on their estates, Junkers still enjoyed quite a bit of independence. For example, they didn't have to pay taxes. The king decided to make work of this, and I'd say he forced the Junkers into buying their lands, so they enjoyed no feudal obligations anymore. Previously, they simply held the land as a fief, but throughout the centuries, this was a tradition from medieval times, the obligations of the vassals using the land, the Junkers in this case, were far less than having to pay an annual tax. So the Junkers were now forced to buy their land, and in turn were forced to accept a permanent tax. I won't bore you with the details, but this so-called allodification of the fiefs was very unpopular, and force often had to be used against nobles that refused. After all, nobles suddenly had to pay tax, whereas under feudal obligations, they were exempt from it. Besides this, the king worked around the clock to improve the inner conditions of Prussia. During great harvests, he made sure the government bought the grain surplus as a reserve for when a famine hit the country. And if that wasn't enough, he ordered the construction of new, large dual-purpose magazines where massive amounts of grain could be stocked. Tariffs were put on foreign grain in order to support domestic farmers. Infrastructure was improved and marshes were drained. The Delta region around the Oder was drained, a project that took several decades to complete. Regions that had either died out due to famine or simply were never populated were now made attractive by the king for settlers. Early in 1732, the king invited over 14,000 Protestant colonists from Salzburg that settled in East Prussia, hitherto scarcely populated. Other architectural projects were undertaken, such as the building of the Dutch quarter in Potsdam by Jan Bouwman. The king ordered the expansion of Potsdam in 1732 so that he could house more soldiers. All in all, this soldier king is often called Prussia's greatest inner king, for a reason. The soldier king was a very sober and pious man, doing all he could to dedicate his life to Prussia. In a move that I think was very telling for his reign, it was one of his last orders issued on the 31st of May 1740, the day he passed away. He ordered the General Directory to ensure that several grain magazines positioned throughout Prussia were restocked before the next winter. It is said he spent his final weeks filling his time with amateur carpentry, namely building his own coffin. As he passed away, the government's revenues had nearly doubled, and the size of his army nearly trebled. With it, it was now on par with France, Russia, and the Habsburg Empire, states that had over 10 times the population of Prussia. Now, I briefly mentioned his son and successor before, Frederick II. The bond between him and his father puts anything we have seen between Hohenzollerns to shame. It was a horrendous relationship, and young Frederick was tormented by his father, who was the polar opposite of him. The relationship between the soldier king and his son, who would become known as Frederick the Great, deserves its own video, which is where I'll explore their relationship in depth. Just to give you a brief hint of what to expect, Frederick was the third son of the soldier king and his wife. The eldest son passed away due to a volley fired too close to his crib. The second son passed away after the heavy crown broke his skull during his baptism. Yeah, definitely something child services wouldn't be too happy with nowadays. If you want to know more about the upbringing of the Soldier King, check out the video I made between the bond of his father, grandfather, and himself, and their relationship in the playlist. And, well, if the next video sounds interesting, consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you very much for watching this video. I would also like to thank all my patrons for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and want to support my work, consider checking me out on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you will already get access to the exclusive Patreon series. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.